All right, so we finished talking about American Indians, and we're going to talk about the next aspect of kind of the American dream, the move west, kind of this build up into what we call the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age really kind of incorporates. It's kind of a part of and includes the move west, although the move west is a little bit kind of separate because it's really talking about kind of the frontier experience and kind of the individualism of kind of the American identity. But it is absolutely a part of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is this period of profound wealth, profound technological development, growth of the economy, growth of the United States influence, growth of the middle class, and yet at the same time you have this period of profound exploitation of less fortunate individuals, and you really have a lot of abject poverty and suffering that happens. So understand that we're kind of building towards this contrast of kind of haves and have-nots, most of whom are have-nots. But another aspect, before we kind of fully get off into that, is you have to understand how the West is developed. The West is crucial towards understanding the Gilded Age. You wouldn't have the Gilded Age and industrialization if you don't have the development of the West and of the raw materials that are out West. And that, of course, it goes back to the development of the railroad and the Homestead Act, but it also has to do with the things that they find in the people that are willing to go out West and settle out there. And so that's very unusual. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is how the American dream, if you think, we talked about, and I touched on this just barely when we talked about American Indians, which is that American Indians were in the way of homesteaders. And homesteaders are often, and I kind of compared them to kind of in the colonial sense, to the pilgrims that came over to place their stake, right, to have opportunities, to have a farm, to grow their families, and in the process gain access to political activity and action and really kind of be involved in the government around them. So you definitely have that being with the Homestead Act. But the other aspect that we saw in the colonial period that also exists in the move west is this idea of I'm going to come make my fortune. I want to make money. I want to be rich. And we saw that in Virginia with the earliest, with the kind of the fops and the explorers that came over to look for gold and silver, and then when they couldn't find that, they developed tobacco plantations, and then they developed cotton plantations, and kind of that expansion of the cotton industry that provided a chance for people to get rich. And you certainly see that as being kind of a driving factor along with the idea of land ownership. So don't forget that. And you have this exists in mining specifically. If you think back to the gold mines of 1849 and kind of the California gold rush and how that drove Western expansion, you'll see other kind of mining finds, mining rushes. The Aaron Huey video touched on the development of gold in the Black Hills. You certainly have the Alaskan gold rush in the late 1800s. But you have other, not about gold, silver, copper, tin, those kinds of things that are found out west. And people kind of get attracted to those things. So it's not just any one specific type of metal, and it's not necessarily one specific location. They do all tend to be western in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, California, that kind of thing. And you do see the same process with mines that we saw, if you think in terms of, say, a cotton plantation where you take individual laborers and how they contribute to the overall wealth of a landowner. If you think about factory workers who are, wage workers that are contributing to the overall wealth of a particular company or a particular owner, the same trend is going to happen for miners. The same trend will happen for ranchers and cowboys. Really, the same trend happens for farmers, although in a slightly different way. So we'll kind of talk about farming separate from miners and ranchers. But one trend of the Gilded Age is this idea of kind of incorporation. That it takes more and more people and more resources to exploit what's in the land. And so that's kind of one of the things. But it all begins with this promise of let's get rich quick. I won't go into detail about the various aspects of mining because we're not about trying to do that. But I do want to point out that you have this process where initially when the metals are on the surface, you can have one guy with a pan and a shovel and he can come out and exploit some of that material. But as the metals get farther under the ground, you have to have more people to dig up the dirt, sort through it, and that kind of thing. We have the sluice mining. And then finally, as the precious metals are way into the earth, you have to have corporations that can expend the resources to bring in specialists for dynamite that can construct these large tunnels and that kind of thing. And so that this process of developing mines really kind of changes and gets more complicated as time goes on. This picture right here is a really good picture about mining. Speaks to a lot of different things. First off, it's a picture of a sluice mine. If you were wondering, like, what on earth is a sluice mine? You can see it takes about seven to 10 guys. The big thing I want to point out here is notice the Asian immigrants in the picture. Asian immigrants are a huge part of this Western story. China was kind of a mess. It had been exploited by the Europeans. The Chinese emperor, the Chinese government was kind of a train wreck, was very ineffectual. And so things were not really great in China in the 1800s. So you had a lot of Chinese men and a few women, but mostly men, that would travel to California and they would take jobs with the Transcontinental Railroad, constructing that. In fact, I would argue that we wouldn't have the Transcontinental Railroad if it wasn't for immigrants, particularly Chinese immigrants, but also Irish immigrants. These immigrants were willing to take jobs that native-born Americans didn't want to take because working on the Transcontinental Railroad was hard work, and it paid well, but it was dangerous, right? Because you're out there in the Great Plains, and there's Indians and all that kind of stuff, and they're resentful of your presence, and it's just dangerous work in general. And so the Chinese laborers in particular were willing to construct that. But they also worked in the mines. They were very good at mining. In fact, one of the initial attractors for the Chinese was the promise of the California Gold Rush. And so just kind of keep in mind that you have lots of Asian immigrants being a part of this mining experience, and kind of, how they add to kind of the diversity of the American experience, even though it becomes very easy to kind of ignore their contributions, but they were incredibly important. Boom and bust towns, one of the aspects about mining and ranching too, is that wherever you have this place where people get off the train and they're ready to go embark, in Colorado or California to go dig for gold or whatever, you're going to have this boom town, this town that develops to provide the materials, the resources, the company that individuals desire and need in order to develop this opportunity. I mean, if you've decided to go be a miner, you're going to need shovels and pickaxes and supplies and food and clothes. And, what if you break your hand and you've got to go to the doctor or something like that? You're going to need a community to support that. So some of these were very basic. They were really kind of like rough and tumble outposts. Some of them, like Denver, will become very successful cities. And of course, their likelihood of becoming a successful city depended on how close to the railroad they really were. Also, how quickly they were able to provide other than just the basics, right? If you could have a town that provided more than just the materials for miners, then you could have a town that maybe had some staying power. One of the issues, though, with these boom towns is, and a lot of this depends on where in statehood this is, but a lot of these places are new territories or new states. There's not a lot of governmental structure in place. There's not a lot of city structure in place. So when that happens, you don't have the law and order. You don't have the stability, which means crime tends to be more likely. And so crime is often controlled in these places by vigilantes. local community members that decide to keep the peace themselves. So this aspect of the Old West that we tend to think of, getting the posse together and that kind of thing, those were real concepts that were a part of this rapid movement of people into the Western Territory and the lack of government structures. Notice also that women have a great deal of opportunity, and we talked about this when we talked about the colonial time and how women, the first women that came into Virginia, had a lot of opportunity. It didn't much matter, like if you were a loose woman or a woman of questionable morals. There weren't very many women, guys really didn't care. And so women could get lots of opportunities to find husbands, to work in jobs, to gain financial independence, and do things that women back east typically would have been frowned upon if they were doing. So I think it's very important for you to grasp that the Western Territory was opportunity not just for men but also for women, but in a different sense, because you typically would not have had a woman, on a cattle drive or as a miner. Their opportunities would have been different, but it's opportunity nonetheless. So really the Western Territory is a place of a lot of change, and a lot of different concepts all happening at once. Ranching and cattle drives, and I throw these in with the mines, largely because ranching and cattle drives tend to have kind of well, maybe not ranching, but the cattle drives certainly have a very kind of definite time period. They don't go on continuously. One of the issues that we see happening after the Civil War is that they had, depleted the beef. You'd had all those men in the southern states, because that's where most of the fighting took place. So you're feeding all these people. The farms up north, ran out of beef cattle. You didn't have enough beef cattle down south. So there's this huge demand when the war is over. Everybody wants a good steak, right? And they're tired of eating, beef jerky and that kind of stuff. And so that you have, because Texas was largely left out of the devastation of the Civil War, you'd had all these longhorn cattle that had just kind of roamed the Texas, and Texas is kind of the southern part of the Great Plains. So these are cattle that are used to harsh weather. They're used to difficult grasses. Are they the best meat? Probably not, but they're better than like beef jerky or something like that. And so people, there's such a huge demand, and so they start driving these longhorn cattle up from Texas up into Kansas to meet up with the railroad. And this is where you kind of have this this kind of fortunate kind of occurrence. You've got former Confederates that are frustrated. You've got blacks who are frustrated with the lack of opportunity in the South, and so they're moving out west. Well, here's a chance to do something they're very familiar with: riding horses, rounding up animals, doing that kind of thing. And they're driving them up to meet up a railroad, and then they get a chance to kind of hang out in town, and then they can go do their own thing. So this is kind of this brief opportunity for a lot of these young men, and there's incredible opportunity to make lots of money from this. So what you're going to see is that it's directly tied to the connection of the railroads. The farther west the railroads go, the long cattle drives really have their heyday for really only about 10 years in the late 1860s to late 1870s. A lot of these cattle drives, are incredibly dangerous. You have lots of loss of cattle. But the thing is, right, they're rounding up these cattle. They're basically getting them for free or next to free, and they're driving them all these miles. It doesn't matter if they lose some, because they're going to still make a ton of money from all of this. And so you have these, you've got the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, all that kind of stuff. And, you can kind of see, you have the end of the trail celebration, that kind of thing. Now, what will happen is people will figure out that the cattle drives have such a loss of life, right? And as there's less longhorns and that kind of thing, they start to figure out, hey, why don't we start just raising beef cattle here close to the railroad, and then we don't have to drive cattle so far up, and we can start having better quality of beef and having better prices and all that kind of stuff. And so you start having this idea of creating these ranches, and it becomes about herd management and breeding certain cows together and controlling the herds and moving them from this pasture to that pasture. You start to have barbed wire fencing. This is where barbed wire steps in, and of course, make no mistake, barbed wire is huge, right? And it's a part of this transition from the cattle drive to the ranching industry, because they figure out, hey, if I can, wire off this area and keep my 100 head of cattle in this one place, then I don't have to ride all over Texas to round them up. And so the barbed wire factors into this. And there will be some conflicts. I don't know. There was a movie a few years ago with Kevin Costner about the range wars between the sheep farmers and the cattle farmers. And so, the barbed wire causes some conflict. But very quickly they figure out that ranching is a really, really efficient way to raise that beef cattle. And in it attracts a lot of foreign investors, a lot of Eastern investors. So there's lots of fresh money coming in, buying up huge sections of land from the railroads, getting them close enough to towns that it's very easy to get the cattle to the railroad to ship them off to the meat packing plants. And so you've got really kind of a boom. You've got this explosion, a bubble, if you will, of investment in ranching. Now what will happen is that you'll have some very difficult winters, some bad conditions. You'll also have kind of that supply and demand factor coming in where ranching very rapidly increases the supply. And so suddenly beef prices drop very quickly. And you're going to see that this is going to kind of cause some fluctuation. So ranching will attract investors. It will be an opportunity to get rich quick, just like mining was an opportunity to get rich quick. And then the bubble will burst and people will kind of lose some money. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt was one of those. He had a ranch in, was it North Dakota, I think it was, that he had invested in, and he almost loses his fortune because of this kind of stuff. So you definitely have the decline of the beef industry, and this will kind of get rid of the cowboys. In fact, if you know of anybody who's involved in ranching, it's really not that much about cattle. About the cowboy and let's round them up and brand them, and a lot of this has to do with herd management. It's not very doesn't have a whole lot of that rugged Old West feel, and that was true by the 1890s. And so this myth of the cowboy is something that's really based on only about 15 years of American history, but it's clearly captured the imagination. Mining and ranching both only become profitable for large corporations that are able to sustain losses and fluctuations in market, that are able to exploit the resources adequately, and that all takes a cash flow, and so corporations are better able to do that. So ranchers that have access to investors and that kind of thing. And again, you're going to have problems with Indians depending on which year you're talking about. This is one of the factors that comes into that, and so you've just got this kind of big business thing that's going on there. Now with farming, what you see, we've talked a little bit about the Homestead Act already. Keep in mind that the Great Plains have very limited rainfall. Water is there, but it's way down deep in the ground. You have to dig these really deep wells. I touched on the sod busters, on this idea of, they have to build their houses out of mud bricks because there's not enough timber. At one point, this was called the Great American Desert because there was so little rainfall out there. Now, it's not a desert in the sense of like the Sahara, but it definitely presents some unique challenges for people that live there because of the harsh weather, because of the lack of rainfall. So the question we have to ask ourselves is what's going to make people choose to leave areas like Ohio and Indiana where there's plenty of rainfall and you've got this great farmland, and start to move out to the Great Plains where the conditions are very, very harsh. And I've mentioned before, it's about railroads, it's about the Homestead Act. Those two things are very, very important. The railroads in particular, remember, they're getting these land grants. And so they want to entice people to buy that land out there. And this is in addition to what people are doing with the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act makes a lot of sense. For very little money, you have a chance to own a farm. But for the railroads, you begin to have this real sales pitch. You have advertising. Come west, have a farm, grab your chance, to own your piece of America, that kind of thing. Most notably, this idea of rain follows the plow, and this is absolutely one of their sales pitches, right? In the 1870s, one of the things about the Great Plains, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, is the Great Plains area typically kind of it'll go through wet decades and dry decades, and then wet decades and then dry decades. And so the 1870s are a period where it's unusually wet, and so it rains a lot more than the standard. And so for people that start taking advantage of this advertisement by the railroad companies, and so it's 1872, and you say, oh, the railroad companies say the rain follows the plow, and there's this great opportunity. I'm going to go take advantage of it. Well, you're actually got a higher likelihood of success in the 1870s than, say, if you wait until 1885 and you try this, because the 1880s are going to be drier than usual. So just kind of understand that this Great Plains area, one of the challenges environmentally is that the weather is unpredictable. And so you can go through entire decades where you have more rain than usual. And so if you'll make business decisions about your crops and about expansion based on that, and then the next decade could be just the opposite. So just kind of understand that that's going to play a role as well. And again, the Homestead Act, this gives you the details of the Homestead Act. Most notably, very minimal money. In some places, they say that it's free land. I don't know, define free. Is a registration fee technically free? Kind of, I guess, because you're not paying for the land, you're paying to register. But needless to say, for very little money, you can get 160 acres. All you have to do is live there for 5 years. And after you've lived there for 5 years, you can start to add land to that. You can start to add, expand your farm, that kind of thing. And so this is a great opportunity for people who may not have a lot of resources. This is why you see some of them having, building sod houses and that kind of thing, because they may not have a lot of money to get out there. And of course, one of the things that we see, they have to build very deep wells. Like I said, very difficult conditions. It's not just about, is it a wet season or a dry season? You're talking, we all know how Texas weather is, okay? So it's not any better in the 1870s, right? You still are going to have, it's going to be warm, and then it's going to be really cold. You're going to have bad weather. You've got insect issues. Prairie fires can be a real problem, especially during a dry season. And it's just very difficult. They have problems with wind erosion. This is one of the things when we talk about the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. The conditions of the Great Plains were not unknown to people. They knew what it was like. And the exploitation of the land begins during this period. So the Dust Bowl of the 1930 is the result of 50 years of farming in an area, and not farming to preserve the topsoil, not farming to take care of the resources, because of this. The environmental conditions are so challenging. Now, one of the aspects of the sales pitch from the railroad companies in the Homestead Act is you have so many people moving out west, and they start creating all these farms. And then, of course, the problem with the agricultural market, which is we've talked about already with the cotton market, is prices go up and down, right? They fluctuate. And so people try to make up a drop in prices by growing more, right? Oh, I have to, the price of corn fell 20 cents, so I need to grow that much more corn. Well, what that does is it overuses the land, and it actually adds to the surplus problem, and this affects the supply and demand curve. So what we'll see happening is a lot of these homesteaders, I say if you take advantage of it in the 1870s, whether you take advantage of the Homestead Act or you take advantage of land from a railroad company, if you come out in the 1870s, you're probably, the earlier the better. You're more likely to have some success. If you come out in the 1880s, you're less likely to have success. But even then, the more farmers that we have moving out west, the more supply we have of farm products, which is going to drop the prices, which is going to make it harder for farmers to make ends meet. And so what will tend to happen is that by the time you get to the 1890s, farmers are really struggling. Many of them are going bankrupt. They're having to sell out to large kind of corporate farms. So you do have these corporations that have lots of investors that can absorb the losses and the price fluctuations. You have a handful of families that are able to kind of move from family farms into kind of that corporate structure. But those are the exception, not the rule. You're going to start to see you have more Great Plains farmers engaging in tenant farming. So this notion of tenant farming doesn't just exist in the Deep South. It will spread westward. And again, let's think about what we read about the cotton tenants. Is that really the American dream? Is tenant farming is renting your land to get kind of stuck in that cycle of agricultural debt? Is that really the American dream? Homesteading starts off as an American dream, but it doesn't really continue as an American dream. And of course, part of this overproduction of products is going to be due to farming technology, new equipment, and wheat will become a major crop. The U.S. will provide the majority of wheat for the country, and really kind of be the only game in town, at least until Russia starts to really develop its wheat production. Of course, Russia is behind everyone else in industrialization, so it takes them a little bit, but that'll be one of our big competitors eventually. So wheat production makes a lot of money. This is where you start to have, as the demand for wheat goes up, as farming becomes more successful, you're going to attract investors. You're going to have people say, hey, let's get together, create investors. Let's buy, 1,000 acres, and we'll have tenants, and we'll farm all of this, and we'll make a ton of money. And this is where you get the idea of bonanza farms. So farming does kind of develop this let's make a bunch of cash kind of mentality, but it's a little bit different with cattle drives and with mining. It's very clearly about get rich quick. Farming has a slightly, I don't know that it's let's get rich quick and get out. Most of the time there's a perception that you're going to start farming and you're going to stay with it, whether you're a corporation or whether you're an individual family. But at the same time, you do have kind of this idea of, hey, wheat prices are high, let's make some money. And you guys saw that with the cotton tenants reading, so you should kind of be familiar with that. I mentioned here already about increased foreign competition, and that's going to drive wheat prices down. And this, again, is going to be part of what we'll see with imperialism at the turn of the 20th century. And I kind of alluded to that a little bit with the closing of the frontier, that this is going to present some anxiety. And so there's going to be, let's go outside our boundaries to find frontiers and kind of take things over. And part of that is going to be about global competition and this emerging globalization, because you don't have industrialization without globalization. So this emerging global economy is going to create some stress, and farmers trying to figure out how American agriculture fits into the global marketplace is going to be a theme that we're going to keep touching on really for a couple more months. You will have a drought in the late 1880s. This drives a lot of people off their farms. And low wheat prices will really affect many homesteaders, and they will end up, having to sell their farms. This will cause some urbanization. Farmers that can't make it on their homesteads will move into the cities, or they'll become tenant farmers, that kind of thing. Notice that I said, tenants grow a third of crops by 1900, and by the time you get to the 1930s, I would argue you've got well over half of all crops are being grown by tenants. This will begin to create some political movement among farmers because of their frustration level, and they will start to kind of to organize. This is where you get the Grange, you'll get the Farmers Alliance, the People's Party, which we'll talk about that more specifically when we talk about politics. Again, emerging global markets, that's a big deal. Tariffs. Farmers will start to be, and we've talked about tariffs before a little bit when we talked about the impending crisis going towards the Civil War, and how the South felt that tariffs to protect the emerging market economy were unfair to the cotton industry. That has not disappeared. And the more you have people taking advantage of the Homestead Act and the land grants and the land available for development out west, and the more people that are involved in agriculture, the more concern there is about tariffs. And there's this idea that the tariffs that are benefiting these emerging factories of the East and of the cities are really kind of doing this at the expense of the farmers. and really making them vulnerable. And so the farmers will blame tariffs and they'll want to fix the tariff issue. And this is going to be a big political hot potato for a long time. And it's going to be a hot potato really till we have the creation of the income tax. And of course, now we all know that the income tax is the hot potato, right? And so tariffs are a big problem. This was the way that the country raised money, the way our government paid for things. And so this is the tie-in of Western expansion with the political system, and it all has to do with emerging farmers and that kind of thing. And like I said, you have this idea of a closing frontier. This is what the Frederick Jackson Turner reading is about. What happens, when we don't have a Western frontier, or, are we going to continue to be a democracy? What are we going to do about opportunity and all that kind of stuff? And so this is going to kind of drive some of our foreign policy decision. It certainly drives some of our what one would call zeitgeist, the kind of mentality of the time. And so you'll kind of see that developing. And so that is kind of the miners and ranchers and the farmers in a nutshell. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this now. You can take a break. I'm not done, so you will come back, but I am going to record this in two different sections. And so you can, if you need to go to the bathroom, if you want to stretch your legs, whatever you want to do, take a few minutes, and then I'll record the next portion.